depending on good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. Thank you very much. This is the first of 3 modules of our spring BPS training. Today, our topic is going to look at capacity accreditation, which is a really important topic. We've seen plenty of movement on this throughout the country, particularly during the past couple of months, and even more during the past couple of weeks. So first, I'm a principal regulatory policy specialist here at NARUC, where I support state regulatory commissions on topics including resource adequacy, performance-based rate making, and really the interplay between state and federal policy implementation, while also maintaining system reliability. I'd like to recognize the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office that makes this training possible. We're also partnering with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory during this 3-part series. If you have any feedback or suggestions or want to learn a little bit more about what NARUC is doing in this space, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is at the bottom of the page. I'll let you all know we did release a report in November on resource adequacy considerations, and it's really aimed at state regulators, so you might want to check that out. Looking at the other courses, next Thursday, we're going to hold our 2nd module, and that's going to look at the changing considerations around integrated resource planning, and we'll sort of see how that's being addressed during the energy transition. And then on the 16th, we'll wrap up this 3-part series with a course on the changing dynamics of regional and interregional transmission planning. So I encourage you all to take a look at our website there where you can register. And then you can also download presentations from 10 other courses that we have on a wide array of bulk power system topics. We've posted those since 2021 when this began. Those topics are largely focused on resource adequacy and reliability. And the advantage is that the material is really directed at NARUC members and really the regulatory community at large. So if you're interested, you can go there, you can download the presentations and watch the recordings on your own time. Before we get started today, I'd like to reiterate that this effort is designed to support you all and your various commissions. We want to ensure that NARUC is offering tools and information that's really useful as you navigate the ongoing transition and evolving systems in your respective states. So take a look at the agenda here. We're going to start with, well, first we're going to hear from 4 distinguished presenters today. They are all experts in their respective subject areas. We have allotted about 30 minutes for each speaker, including Q&A. So we encourage you all to go ahead and use that Q&A feature with Zoom and submit your questions throughout their presentations. I'm going to defer to each presenter as to whether or not they want to tackle the questions on a rolling basis or save them till the end. But we're hoping our speakers can also stick around for about 10 to 15 minutes at the end, where we can have some kind of more cross-cutting discussions. First, we're going to hear from Genna de Mijolla. She's with EPRI. She'll kick us off with the fundamentals and history of capacity accreditation. And that's going to set the stage for Kevin to sort of dig us deeper into the important implications of ELCC, which is the most widely sort of accepted approach, and it uses statistical modeling to account for particularly intermittent forms of capacity. So then we'll take a break at 2:10. We'll come back at 2:20 and hear from Arne Olson with E3. He's going to talk about perfect capacity and other frameworks for accreditation. And then Zachary Ming is going to kind of pull this all together by explaining the latest developments in organized markets throughout the country and really explain how accreditation methods are being incorporated into various capacity and energy markets. So first, I'd like to introduce Genna. Genna is a technical leader at EPRI. She's an engineer with over 7 years of experience in the power systems field and specializes in resource adequacy, production cost modeling, and renewable integration. Genna has experience working both as an individual contributor as well as a project manager from the proposal stage all the way to completion on a diverse range of projects, including large-scale renewables and other asset valuation analyses. So Genna, the floor is yours. We'll go ahead and share your screen and you can take it away.
Awesome, sounds good. I just got a note that my internet is perhaps unstable. So at any point, if you stop being able to hear me, let me know and I'll switch to a different form of audio. But for now, I'm hoping everything will be okay. All right, hopefully you can all see my screen all right. So I wanted to kick off the discussion with a little bit of maybe a broader view of some of the fundamentals and history of capacity accreditation. So I'll start out by talking through motivation for capacity accreditation. I took this image from a recent ESIG report focused around capacity accreditation. I think this does a really good job of kind of highlighting some of the numerous motivations that we have within the capacity accreditation space. So one of them and a key consideration is ensuring efficient reliability for the system. So we want a system that's not only reliable, but does that in an efficient, cost-effective manner. Another key consideration is sending a price signal to new market entrants. So especially if you've got some kind of capacity auction mechanism in place, how do you send the correct price signal to market entrants? And then a third consideration there is ensuring that load serving entities are meeting reliability obligations. And really, when we think about resource accreditation, there's a few different components to it. And the first is kind of the resource adequacy, the probabilistic assessments that we run when we're trying to assess whether or not a system has an adequate set of resources or not. And those are the same, that's the same tool that we use to calculate resource accreditation values. And that's then what gets passed on to other applications, like, for example, your capacity expansion modeling applications. So the next piece is sort of long-range supply resource expansion planning. So especially using integrated resource plans. And that's where you take the accreditation values that were assigned in sort of that first piece, the resource adequacy assessment piece, applied to different resources. And that helps you with the accuracy of your capacity expansion process. So you can then determine a system that's cost optimal and reliable. And then the third piece I wanted to highlight here is the electricity markets piece. And I think here we mostly think about capacity auctions, but I want to highlight that there's a few different pieces you could potentially also meet system adequacy or incentivize system adequacy, such as, for example, scarcity pricing or bilateral exchanges. But I think for the most part, people think about capacity auctions as one of the primary mechanisms here. And really the accreditation value that you assign your resources there is going to be really important in terms of determining the appropriate capacity payment levels for each of your resources in terms of how much they can contribute to your system reliability. So that's just a little bit of level setting of some of the motivations for capacity accreditation. The next thing I want to talk about is a really brief history of capacity accreditation. So initially, when we had systems that were primarily composed of thermal resources, we had a very simple system there. We would just look at the installed capacity of all our existing and our planned resources and sort of just sum those up and check how that compared to our planning reserve margin. And so that is calculated as basically the peak demand in a year of your system plus some additional safety margin, usually something like 12 to 18%. And then in phase 2, we started transitioning away from ICAP, so this installed capacity, to using more UCAP for thermal units, unforced capacity. And that's where we start bringing in some of the individual resource characteristics as it relates to their equivalent forced outage rate. And then at this level, when we were having wind and solar resources, we would usually be using just a deterministic accreditation process. So this was usually just looking at their historical output over some predetermined system risk window and just averaging across that window. And now in phase 3, now we're really starting to lean more and more on what we call probabilistic methods, ELCC being the best known one. I do want to highlight that some of the groundwork for these probabilistic methods been started a while ago. So 1930s, we had early research on this. 1966, some of the work in terms of developing a linear approximation technique was really instrumental there. But really, it wasn't until the mid-1990s where we started looking at ELCC and considering it much more seriously in terms of how we could apply it initially to at least systems with renewable and especially wind generation. So quick overview there on the history of capacity accreditation. The next thing I want to touch upon is this idea of probabilistic versus deterministic metrics. So if you think about the history I went over, initially we were more on the deterministic side of things. So your ICAP and your UCAP and looking at average generation over historic peak hours, those are all considered deterministic methods. You don't necessarily need to run a probabilistic resource assessment to determine capacity accreditation with those methods. And then we've got sort of the whole probabilistic piece of the puzzle. And I'd say there's sort of two broad categories there, and you can split it up a few different ways, but this idea of marginal versus average accreditation. And I won't touch on that too much because I saw that Kevin has a talk on that right after me, but useful framework to sort of keep in mind there. And one of the things I want to highlight is I've noticed that ELCC sometimes is being used increasingly to just refer to everything on that probabilistic accreditation method side of things. So ELCC does have sort of a specific methodology to it historically. There are other very related methods that are also probabilistic that share a lot of common features with ELCC, but might not be exactly categorized as an ELCC metric. So something to keep in mind there, and I'll go over a quick definition of that later in this presentation. The other thing I wanted to touch on is this idea of bringing a system to criterion. And so that's been the norm. Oftentimes we use an LOLE of 0.1 days per year, at least within North America. That's been our historical reliability target. And so most of the time what you do is you establish that target and then you bring your system to criterion before calculating your capacity accreditation metric. And so this can be done a few different ways. You can sort of adjust your load up or down, or add perfect capacity, or adjust the retirements in your system. So there's a few different ways you can go about this, usually a bit of an iterative process. But I think it's important to understand that the way you do this is going to impact the value of your capacity accreditation calculation. So it's something that's non-trivial, and it's worth just really reflecting on sort of if your system should be brought to criteria, should it be calculating using actual system LOLE values? If you bring it to criterion, what should that criterion level be? Because it is going to influence the system and then by extension, your capacity accreditation values. So something to keep in mind there. The next few slides, I want to highlight a few of the primary capacity accreditation methods, especially the probabilistic capacity accreditation methods that we see. So the first one is ELCC, and I think this is the one most folks are familiar with. I do want to highlight that there's another method called equivalent firm capacity. It's very similar to ELCC. They're sometimes used interchangeably. They do have a few slight distinctions. So if you look at ELCC, the graph you see on the left here illustrates that. And so you start at 0.1, which is you have a system that is at your 0.1 LOLE criterion. And then what you do is you add a new resource to the system, And so that's going to make your system more reliable, and it's going to decrease your LOLE. And so that's what's represented in point 2 of that chart there. And then you're going to go through an iterative process of adding load back to the system until you bring it back to that 0.1 LOLE criterion. And so the amount of load that you add in there corresponds to your ELCC value. Now, equivalent firm capacity is a really similar concept. Again, you start at your 0.1 LOLE. You're going to remove a resource instead of adding it, and that's going to increase your LOLE a little bit. And now, instead of modifying the load of the system, you're actually going to add perfect capacity back into your system until it's brought back to that 0.1 LOLE criterion. And so the amount of perfect capacity that you add back into your system is going to correspond to your EFC value, your equivalent firm capacity value. And I'll just say here on a very basic level, firm capacity is just capacity that's available and responsive for demand at any point within the year. So there's no constraints on ramping or anything like that. And most importantly, there's no forced outage rate associated with it. And there's a little bit of a subset to EFC. It's called equivalent conventional power. And instead of adding back in perfect capacity, you're adding back in sort of what looks like a conventional unit. Oftentimes that's a combustion turbine with sort of the outage profile that corresponds to that unit, and then seeing how much capacity you add of that, and that's your ECP. So there's a little bit of distinction there between the same methods, but they are, I would say, more similar than they are dissimilar. And then importantly, there's sort of these iterative methods where you do have to iteratively add load or capacity to get to that level of reliability. Now, there's another method that's been developed, which is your marginal reliability improvement method. And one of the things that some folks like about this method is that you have sort of a set number of iterations. Once your system's at criterion, you'll have 2 extra set of simulations to run. And so the way that this works is you, again, start with your LOLE that's defined at criterion, usually 0.1 days per year. And so the first simulation you do is you add some level of megawatt corresponding to the resource whose accreditation you're trying to evaluate, and you evaluate the resulting LOLE of the system. And then you do that again, but instead of adding the specific resource you're looking at, you add in perfect capacity of the same size, and you look at the LOLE of that resulting system. And so the marginal reliability improvement is calculating as the delta difference between those 2 values. So your change in LOLE when you have the resource you're evaluating over your LOLE with that perfect capacity added in. And that's your resulting capacity value. And I will say I've seen MRI calculated a couple of different ways. I've seen it defined with LOLE. I know ISO New England's defining it with EUE, so there's a little bit of nuance there in terms of how it can be calculated, but that's the general idea. The last metric I want to touch on is this idea of LLP capacity factor method. It's something that was put forward in the recent ESIG report around capacity accreditation. Not that it was necessarily new there. I think there's been some work done previously for it, but they do have a good illustration of it. And it looks at the average availability of a resource during some high risk period. And essentially, the key advantage of this method over other ones is you really don't require that iterative modeling that you might have required with some of the previous methods I went over. So this example is from that ESIG report, and I think it does a good job of illustrating it. The left-hand image, you have the system unserved energy, and so you see that that's broken out by hour of the year and by sample, so every weather year and uncertainty iteration there. And they've done the same thing for generator availability. So you can see the availability level of that generator. And so they'll consider all of the hours where you see some level of unserved energy, and those are highlighted in orange. And for those corresponding hours, they'll basically pull out the generator availability and kind of average that across all those hours. And that's how they come up with the LLP capacity factor. So one thing I want to touch on here is the fact that there's so many different ways to go about these capacity accreditations. I've sort of scratched the surface here, but there's a lot more that could be said even about this marginal versus average discussion, which I think Kevin will get into. There's this idea of prospective versus retrospective. You know, are you looking at historical unit output? Are you using the forecasted unit output? And even within a same method, I think there's a lot of variation that can be had. So historically, ELCC has been calculated with LOLE, but there's no reason you couldn't calculate it with EUE or LOLH or some other metric. There's variation and nuances in terms of the perturbation method. You applied, you add or remove your capacity? Do you increase load? Do you increase perfect supply? The choice of your resource adequacy target. So if you use that 0.1 LOLE target versus not is going to influence your results. How you bring your system to that target is going to have an impact on results. If you consider that LLP capacity factor method I just talked to you about, I mean, they were advocating for looking at the straight average across all unserved energy hours, but you could really look at your you could instead consider some kind of weighted average where the most severe hours are weighted more heavily. You could look at close call hours where your system's maybe not explicitly in a shortfall event, but has very low margin. So there's really so much nuance in terms of how you can go about looking at this. And that's something I wanted to highlight to this group. A few key insights as well that I wanted to highlight that we've come up here at EPRI. The first thing to keep in mind is typically when you look at the adequacy of a system, there's not very many risk hours. You know, if you've got an LOLE of 0.1, it's really a handful of hours at risk, if that. And so your resource accreditation methods, if they're calculated using these probabilistic methods, are really obtained during a relatively small numbers of hours in the year. So however your resource performs within those select few hours is going to really impact its capacity accreditation value. The second thing to keep in mind is this idea that accreditation depends both on individual unit characteristics, which feels pretty intuitive, but it's also really dependent on the LOLE shape of the system. So two resources that look completely identical from a individual resource characteristic side of things could look vastly different, could have vastly different capacity accreditation values depending on which system they are located in. The third insight is that risk is not necessarily correlated with peak loads. And so we see that increasingly as we have growing shares of renewable resources. We're seeing a lot of that risk shifting to net peak load periods. But even within that, you could have a risk period that really doesn't look that risky from a demand point of view, and maybe has a big fuel shortage or something like that that's modeled. And that could be where you're seeing a lot of your loss of load risk, and that's where you would need your resources available. The fourth insight is that accreditation characteristics of thermal resources do differ from those of variable energy resources. I think that's guided a lot of the previous sort of way that we've organized capacity accreditation with sort of different methodologies for thermal versus variable renewable resources. I think there is a little bit of an effort from the industry to try to consolidate this into a same method, but that was really guiding some of the decisions we made historically. The fifth insight is this idea of storage and energy limited resources. So they're actually very tricky to credit in the sense that the way that you model them in the underlying model is going to influence your capacity accreditation value. So for example, if you model your storage unit as optimizing minimum system costs versus holding back capacity and energy just to meet those loss load events, that's going to look different from a probabilistic sort of risk metric perspective, and by extension is going to look different from a capacity accreditation perspective. And the sixth insight we have is this idea that transmission and import capacity are going to impact your resource adequacy, and so by extension, your accreditation. So that's an important factor to consider there as well. I want to change gears here a little bit and talk about sort of things that aren't necessarily traditionally thought of as capacity accreditation, but these probabilistic methods, they are all based on sort of these core models that have a lot of complexity built in within them. They use different tools from one model to another. There's a lot of different data inputs you can put in there. And these things, I'd argue, might have an even larger impact in some cases on your capacity accreditation results than the specific method you're using. So it's important to sort of keep that in mind as you're going through the capacity accreditation method, that whether or not you're modeling short-term forecast error, how you're modeling your energy storage, what kind of data you input into your model is going to be hugely impactful on your results from a capacity accreditation point of view. So that's something that's worth spending the time and effort on to make sure you get right. And then another thing that we're thinking of at EPRI is this idea of operational features within resource adequacy. So traditionally, operational features just haven't really been incorporated into resource adequacy models, just because of the fact of it's so computationally expensive to really incorporate that fully. But that does beg the question, in some of the accreditation methods we see today, depending on how your system's modeled, you might have one unit that starts up instantly and can instantly provide energy to the grid, and another one that might have a 4-hour ramp time, and those would be accredited in the same way in a number of capacity accreditation frameworks to date. And so should that be the case? So that's something we are going to be exploring a little bit further here at EPRI in 2024 and beyond, and something that I think is important to start thinking about as an industry. And then finally, a little bit of a whirlwind here, but I want to touch on a couple of EPRI initiatives and public documents that have either come out or are soon going to be coming out. So the first is our Resource Adequacy Initiative. If you haven't heard about it, it was a multi-year initiative we had here at EPRI, and it really looked at sort of more of the core model, the core probabilistic assessment features. And so we came up with a lot of recommendations around what metrics we think should be utilized, how individual resource models should be set up, what data sources we recommend, did an evaluation of the various resource adequacy tools that are out there, and really compiled that in terms of put forward a lot of guideline reports that are all available at this epri.com/resource adequacy link that's listed here. So publicly available there. And we've also got 6 case study reports that have been published. So 6 different regions within the US, and it was really looking at kind of grounding a lot of those recommendations within the case study work we did there. So I'd encourage you, if you've got the time and interest, to take a look at that. I think we've got all reports except for one out at this point in time. And the second thing I want to highlight really quickly is some of our upcoming resource adequacy efforts. And we're really going to be focusing on the interaction between capacity expansion models and resource adequacy models. So those are 2 processes that ideally should be very closely linked and coordinated. That is not always the case, but we're moving towards that more and more so. So we're wanting to provide guidance on sort of how you can bridge the gap between capacity expansion modeling and resource adequacy modeling. And one thing we're doing for that, we've got a Plexus model for a regional North American system. And we're leveraging this model to come up with an analysis, basically doing a round trip analysis. So you start with sort of a set of capacity values. You run them through your capacity expansion model, input that plan within your resource adequacy model, calculate your LOLE and resulting capacity accreditation metrics, and sort of run that through to convergence. And so we've got sort of a first round trip analysis done at this point for 3 different capacity accreditation methodologies. We're looking to run that for more methodologies, and then importantly to sort of look at some of the nuances I was talking about before in terms of how exactly a methodology is implemented, or some of the other modeling constraints within the system and how that can impact your results. So look out for that. I think that will likely be public when it does come out. But that's, I think, all I have. So I don't know if I can see the chat. I don't know if there's any questions in there yet, Elliot.
We don't have any yet. Certainly encourage all the participants to drop them into the Q&A or the chat. Really, either one works. And Genna, great presentation. Really well done. Sets the stage and lays the foundation here. So thank you again.
No problem.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or the Q&A, so we'll keep moving here. Actually, one just came in. Here we go. Okay, so yeah, I guess the chat is disabled, but would recommend that you use the Q&A feature. All right, moving along here. Next, we will hear from Kevin Carden. He is the founder and CEO of Astrapé Consulting, which is an energy consulting organization with a focus on resource planning. And under Kevin's leadership for the past 19 years, Astrapé has provided consulting services to utilities, regulators, and ISOs all over the world. Kevin has also led the redevelopment of ServM, which is an industry-leading resource adequacy planning tool licensed by Astrapé. And additionally, his responsibilities have included reliability and resource adequacy study for clients across the country here. He's projected financial analysis and project analysis, RFP independent evaluation, renewable capacity evaluation, demand side management, program development, and contract management for many large capital projects. Kevin holds a Bachelor in Science in Industrial Engineering from the University of Alabama, and he holds a patent in the US for generator reliability modeling techniques. So Kevin, I will turn it over to you, and thank you.
Great, thanks for the intro, Elliot. And my presentation is going to be fairly quick. I'm going to key in on primarily kind of principles for capacity accreditation. The work that we do across the country, and as Elliot mentioned, we license the ServM model. Many of the ISOs, RTOs, large utilities across the country, and various NERC regional entities and other regulators use ServM to look at resource adequacy needs and explore a lot of these capacity accreditation questions and issues. I'm going to flag some of the complications that have been raised with respect to capacity accreditation. I know there was mentioned in the title that I would be addressing some distinction between marginal and average accreditation, and I will provide some of that context, but I don't want to make this particular venue a debate between marginal and average ELCC, as I'm sure Arne and Zach will mention. There is fairly broad consensus around marginal accreditation for a lot of the capacity markets. I think we just need to understand some of the concerns and implications around various nuances to how that is ultimately implemented. Still have some reservations about particular applications of marginal accreditation, and I will highlight some of those, but I want to kind of set the framework for fundamental kind of principles of how we understand or how we should think about capacity accreditation. Genna did a great job of kind of presenting some of the technical details of how a lot of those assessments are done. Hopefully I can provide a little bit higher level view of kind of the principles that go behind some of that analytical work. Okay, so one of the key principles of capacity accreditation, the goal of capacity accreditation is that all resources are intended to be paid the same price for the same product, or we're trying to assess normalize the contribution that every resource brings. So a wind resource versus a solar resource versus a storage resource versus a thermal resource. We need to understand, how do those resources contribute to reliability? Typically in the capacity accreditation framework, because they do use marginal ELCC, it is tested on the margin. What does the last resource contribute to reliability? If I think about California, a system that has goals of substantial solar resources, and plus they have lots of behind the meter solar, you think about a system that has 30 to 50 gigawatts of solar resources, then how much do you expect it to contribute to reliability on the margin? Well, the answer is, during the summer, not very much. The net load peak is going to occur after sunset. So your reliability problems will occur at 10 o'clock at night or 11 o'clock at night. How do we resolve those issues on the margin when we have to add new resources that can contribute during that time period? So certainly need to kind of understand how resources contribute, but we do think that there is value in understanding how resources contribute to reliability in a composite manner, or in an average ELCC context as well. What are the total portfolio of resources that we need in order to supply reliability? And I'll kind of talk about some of those in the context of how some of the market designs have been put into place. So with that in mind, though, this normalization, we're trying to understand what every resource contributes to reliability. How do we measure that? How do we perform that normalization? As Genna mentioned, there are various approaches to doing that. One of the ones that I want to talk about, because I think it has implications for how we move forward with this, I think there's a lot of value to, is the DLOL concept. And DLOL is effectively the output during loss of load hours. So direct loss of load, what it stands for, and we will essentially run servum simulations. So in MISO, they run servum simulations and look at, hey, during this loss of load hour, what was the output or availability of every resource class in the system? And that will determine the accreditation for that particular resource or resource class. And the intention is that based on that accreditation, whatever percentage you get of nameplate, so a wind resource may get 15%, and a solar resource may get 20%, and storage may get 80%. That multiplied by the capacity price kind of determines their compensation in the capacity market. When we make that determination, though, so we say direct loss of load, output during loss of load hours, there's some consideration of, well, do we just look at those 1 in 10 events? They are very infrequent, as Genna mentioned. And so we're testing on this very rare occurrence. And does that comport with the contribution that these resources are really bringing? So this question of how do we define what those critical hours should be is certainly important as well. There's also a distinction that says we have capacity issues and we have energy issues. There could be a constraint on the total energy availability if we exhaust the state of charge of all of the batteries and we end up with a moderate load level. We could still have reliability issues because there's not adequate energy in the system to keep those batteries charged, to be able to discharge during that particular period. So that would be an energy constraint versus a capacity constraint. It is just that stack of resources against load. What are the risks of capacity shortfalls versus energy shortfalls? And how do we compare across the different types of constraints that could come up in resource adequacy models? Let me use that as a segue into the next slide that talks about some of these questions in a little bit more detail. And we see it in the context of looking at this wide array of potential technologies that could help us with resource adequacy going forward. It won't be a single silver bullet technology that comes in and saves the day. We add lots of solar, it can contribute to reliability for a period, but if we shift the net load till after sunset, maybe it doesn't contribute as much in the margin. But then as we add storage resources, that's going to shift the need for more energy, and that solar can then contribute again. So we have this synergy between solar and storage. And there's also not simply a single storage technology that may solve the day. We have hybrid resources. We have different durations of resources, different technologies with different chemistries and different technical parameters. So how do all those fit in? So I just wanted to raise one question here in the context of marginal accreditation and how this ultimately has to be addressed. If we think about a system that has some penetration of 1 hour storage, of 2 hour storage, and of 4 hour storage, and we look at the bid prices into a capacity auction of those particular resources, if I was a vertically integrated utility, how would I select those resources? Well, from the capacity constraint side, it makes sense to procure some 1 hour storage resources because they're much cheaper, $50 a kilowatt here in this example, and then procure some 2 hour resources at $75 a kilowatt year, and then procure additional tranche of resources, of 4 hour resources at $100 a kilowatt year. But if I look at the marginal contribution of the next resource beyond that, what is the duration that I need? It's actually 4 hours or longer. And so how could a 1 hour resource contribute to that marginal need? Well, this ELCC concept is only going to give that 1 hour resource 25% credit or less. So what are the implications of that? Well, if we measure everything on the margin, we pay everything on the margin, if he's only getting credit for 25%, but the 4 hour gets 100%, well, he's only going to get paid $25 a kilowatt year. So it's no longer economic to select that resource, and he wouldn't clear in the auction, therefore. And now we're going to have to buy more 4 hour storage to fill that capacity gap. So we've ended up spending more. Consumers are forced to spend more because of this marginal concept that doesn't allow for the selection of distinct or different resources within that class. And so there are complications like that. I'm not trying to advocate here for one approach or the other. I'm just trying to recognize that there are challenges with every approach. Average has its own drawbacks as well, that it creates disincentives for bidding kind of to your resource characterization or the parameters that you have. So there are drawbacks to all methods. So I don't want to paint this as a simple picture, but I do want to recognize that there are complications even with kind of the marginal framework that is generally being adopted nationwide. Another question is, how do we address maintenance considerations? In MISO, they have a seasonal auction framework. So for each of 4 seasons, we have to clear enough capacity to meet reliability targets. Now, if we're meeting a 1 in 10 standard in the summer, where we expect most of our reliability events to occur, and you can see the peak loads happened here in the summer, we're at 120,000 megawatts of net load in this example. So significant needs in the summer, that's where we expect most of the reliability events occur. But during the spring and fall, where we have significant maintenance that's scheduled, we could also surface reliability events. And we actually saw some prices in the fall and spring in last year's seasonal auction that reflected there is some potential for risk in the spring and the fall. What are the implications for scheduling maintenance? Typically, what's going to happen with a maintenance schedule is a generator may request a particular schedule, or they may be given a particular schedule that says, we're going to put this resource at a particular time window in the spring or in the fall. You need 30 days on maintenance, we'll put you in that time window. Well, most of the selections are done from a system perspective. We're not trying to optimize for each individual resource to make sure that he gets the most credit in an accreditation framework. It's really, how do we protect system reliability? And it may be that one resource gets put into this kind of higher risk period in the spring or the fall, and another resource gets put in a low risk period. But they both had the same objective. We both needed 30 days of maintenance during this particular season. So should there be a distinction between the accreditation impact of that maintenance? I do strongly believe that maintenance should influence accreditation, because a resource that doesn't have as onerous of a requirement on the maintenance side shouldn't be penalized as strongly. But 2 resources with 5% maintenance rate, should they get the same accreditation impact of that input? I think the answer is yes, but that's going to entail more complicated analysis and more involved work in order to equitably split the impact of those maintenance schedules on the individual resources. So that's something that entities are generators primarily concerned about, want to make sure that there's equitable treatment across the board. Another item here, and I'll wrap up my presentation, is just this question, and both Genna and I have already identified this or flagged this, that most of the reliability events occur in a very small window of hours. If we're running hundreds of thousands of hourly simulations, and we're modeling to a 1 day in 10 standard, I mean, that's a very small window of hours in which we'll shed firm load. And so the performance of these resources is contingent on how they do in this very small window. But if I think about managing reliability from a practical standpoint, I think about Texas last summer when we had 45 days in a row where we had temperatures above 100 degrees in parts of Texas. And if we hadn't had the wind and solar fleet, then we would have shed load on every single day in that entire period. But if I look at the worst day, wind and solar output are very low, they get very little credit. Then what does that do for their incentive to be available there for that 45-day window where we have really high temperatures? So we need to make sure that we take into account those considerations. And I think Arnie's going to talk about that as well. How do we incentivize performance and make sure that you provide the reliability, not just in that 1 day in 10 years, but in each critical day that occurs every year. So one thing we've looked at for certain entities is perhaps a top 3% tightest hours in a year, top 30 hours per year. And there are various constructs that are looking at this in Texas with the performance credit mechanism, highest 30 or the tightest 30 hours per season, maybe the measurement window for how resources get accredited. So there are different ways of doing that, but ultimately we do need to have some understanding of the alignment between these modeling efforts that are made and how resources are expected to perform and how they're measured in actual practice. And that's the end of my presentation. I'll hand it back over to you, Elliot.
Kevin, that was great. Thanks very much. And I think we did have one question here that popped up a little bit earlier in the chat. And this one was actually for Genna. Genna, I don't know if you're able to jump back in here. But the question was, are the operational considerations for resource adequacy assessments that you mentioned the same thing as energy adequacy assessments?
Yeah, and answered it briefly in the chat, but happy to expand on it if need be. We're really looking at going even beyond what energy, so I think energy adequacy is something that's sort of fairly accepted as something we should be considering within the adequacy framework, especially as we're getting more storage resources within the system. When I was talking about operational aspects, we've sort of been referring to it as flexibility adequacy within EPRI. So it would be looking at really incorporating things like your ramp rate constraints and maybe short-term forecast errors and all those components. Now, it does sort of beg the question, how do you incorporate that within the adequacy framework? Should you be incorporating that within the adequacy framework? Should you instead be looking at deterministic runs to supplement your probabilistic analysis? So it's a little bit more of a, I think, an open area for exploration there, but really goes into sort of some of the operational constraints that you might more traditionally associate with production cost modeling, and to what extent those should be considered within the resource adequacy framework.
And Elliot, can I offer another observation as well? Genna, that was a great explanation. Certainly agree with what you said. I think it's important to make it clear that, as Genna mentioned, energy adequacy is essentially always tested in most resource adequacy frameworks that are employed. Certainly in SERVM, the work that I've been doing energy adequacy assessments for 25 years, going back to my days at Southern Company, where we were doing studies for demand response that had energy limitations. We're always testing for energy adequacy. There have been certain assumptions that have been taken for granted, for instance, fuel supply. we assume that there's adequate fuel supply. And so that may be one variable that could influence energy adequacy. But in general, we are testing for making sure that charging and discharging, the state of charge in the batteries influences the reliability metrics that come out of the models. Or it could be pump storage hydro that has energy constraints. It could be conventional hydro that has constraints. So all that work goes into the energy adequacy space. And generally models are fully testing for that type of constraint right now. I think this operational question is really important. And we have always advocated that full operational modeling is essential for resource adequacy planning. We don't think that reliability planning can be a stack model that just takes all your capacity resources and compares to load and identifies the probability of having a shortfall. We think the way that you operate the system can influence reliability, and it goes beyond just this question of flexibility. Does the ramp rate influence the ability of that resource to come online? Because if I operate a system, say we add a lot of storage and I need to carry more operating reserves, carrying those operating reserves entails turning on more units, and turning on more units raises the risk of more generator outages. Having a net load shape that is has a really deep dip in the middle of the day and comes back up means you're having to start units or cycle them more frequently. And if I cycle the units more frequently, I may have a shortfall because the units are more likely to fail if they have to start, if they have to cycle more frequently. The run hours on the unit influences kind of the composite outage profile of the system. And so all those factors, you really need to model the system the way that it actually operates in order to understand resource adequacy. This is not just a question of economics. Are we replicating the economics of the system? But really to calibrate and understand how resource adequacy works. It can't be an Excel spreadsheet that stacks up resources and compares to load.
Absolutely agree with everything there.
Are there any other questions for either Genna or Kevin? If not, I guess I could throw one out there. So yeah, you kind of mentioned, both of you, and especially Kevin, the sort of the challenge in modeling when, not just when batteries are going to discharge and maintaining reliability, but also when they charge, which I would imagine would be when, of course, your prices are low. But in terms of looking out when you have a system that's with increasing amounts of storage on it, how do you model when they're going to actually charge and then ensure that there's adequate other resources available for that?
Genna, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, a few different things I'd say for that. First off, I would, if you're interested in energy storage, especially guide you towards our Texas case study and our WEC case study analysis that we performed within the RA initiative. What we were seeing there is increasingly, as you go into higher and higher renewable level of resources, you're actually starting to move away from sort of what we call charging constrained loss of load events into discharging constraints towards charging constrained events. So at the start, if you've got an adequacy event, it's because your storage ran out of, they used up all their energy. It was a longer event. But what we're seeing as we move into higher renewable futures is there's actually sometimes instances where there's not enough time between consecutive events for energy storage to fully recharge. So I would say that's a question that's going to be more and more important. I think when there was really low amounts of storage on the system, you could sort of always assume that they'd be fully charged going into an event. And I don't think that's always going to be the case going forward. In terms of sort of how you model the storage, I think a lot of our models today sort of assume that a perfect foresight. So it seems very obvious in terms of when you'd want to sort of charge or discharge your storage when you know exactly what's going to be happening in the future. That's not necessarily what's going to be happening operationally. If a storage unit sees some kind of high-priced event, are they going to just take the money there and discharge? Are they going to wait in case there's an even bigger event in the future? I think you get into sort of market price caps there as well, which once you hit a market price cap, I think your storage unit's just going to go all in and discharge their energy into the grid. even if maybe there was another event that might have more unserved energy coming forward that could maybe utilize that more from a system perspective. So very much an open area of research, and I think a lot of complexity there.
Kevin, anything to add, or?
No, I certainly agree with what Genna had to share. We certainly see this as a constraint going forward, especially as you think about some of the technologies that are coming to bear, some of the longer duration technologies. They have a really low round trip cycle efficiency. So that means that they need a lot more energy to charge. So that could make that constraint more binding. I think this question of modeling the system the way that it actually operates influences this as well. Because if I just do a resource stack during those low load hours, it may show that, hey, we have adequate resources available. But are you willing to dispatch demand response in order to charge your batteries? Are you going to discharge from longer duration batteries in order to charge shorter duration batteries? There are lots of questions that kind of come into play with how you actually operate the system in order to maintain that reliability. So from a kind of pure mathematical standpoint, it may be that, yes, we have the ability to charge, but in terms of practical application, some of those may not work. Also, things like if we have to run units harder in order to provide that energy to charge the batteries, that's going to have implications for outages on the conventional fleet as well. So there's a lot that goes into that. But again, it comes back to, for me, replicating the way the system actually works when I'm doing this resource adequacy assessment.
Seems to me there's been, some parallels between the maybe early 2000s when we had the wind and solar coming onto the system at various rates at different parts of the country. And I think in many cases, you had kind of little laboratories that kind of saw how different accreditation and sort of projected approaches to assess the reliability of those resources. They were modified. There was kind of this feedback loop where the operators would explain or share their challenges, and then they would adjust a little bit. And perhaps we'll see the same to some degree with batteries. You're seeing a lot of different proposals throughout in different market areas throughout the country. When I think of like California, the slice a day and how they're going to be, and I know Zach's going to get into this a little later, but my understanding is the proposal is they'll have to account for when they're going to be charging those batteries, and the resource adequacy resources, so-called, will depend on that, to make sure that you're accounting for not only, getting to the level of that hour when you're going to discharge, but also making sure there's adequate resources for the charging beforehand. So really interesting stuff. I think we're a little ahead of schedule. I guess I'll open it up to either of you if you have anything to add, any additional comments. Okay, well, we're
looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, I guess we're 10 minutes ahead of schedule. So we were aiming to take a break at 2:10, but we'll just go a little bit early here, and we'll come back at 2:10. That'll save us a little bit of time for additional discussion at the end. So I think, Arne, I think you are next. So we'll see you in about 10 minutes and look forward to that. Excellent. Arne, if you're on, maybe we can go ahead and make sure that your screen share capability works here.
Okay, yes. Hi, Elliot. I'm on. Let me give this a shot here. You see that?
Yeah, it looks good. If you can go full screen, we'll be in business here. Yep, perfect. I'll do a brief introduction for you if that works, and then I'll hand it over.
Sounds great.
Great. All right, so Arne Olson, he leads E3's bulk energy infrastructure practice, helping clients navigate changes to the bulk electric system operations and investment needs brought by an increasing policy and market interest in clean and renewable energy production. He has led a number of landmark studies of feasibility and costs of achieving deep decarbonization and high renewable penetration goals for electric utilities, including studies of 100% renewables and net zero energy systems in New England, California, the Pacific Northwest, and the Midwest. Arne has also led the development of E3's industry-leading resource planning software, including the Resolve model that develops optimal portfolios of renewable, conventional, and energy storage resources, and the Recap model that calculates loss of load probability and related statistics to ensure that power systems can meet load reliably under high renewable penetrations. He has over 25 years of experience in energy analysis, and he is frequently speaking at energy conferences on the role of renewable energy and how it will play in decarbonizing the grid. Prior to joining E3 in 2002, Arne served for 6 years with the Energy Policy Division at the Washington State Energy Office. He holds a Master's in Science in International Energy Management and Policy from the University of Pennsylvania, and 2 degrees in the Bachelor of Science, one in Statistics, another in Mathematical Sciences from the University of Washington. So Arne, thank you again for joining us today. And I'll hand it over.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Elliot. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to this group about capacity accreditation, resource adequacy, resource need. I guess just in addition, and thanks for that nice introduction, in addition to the experience that Elliot mentioned, I'll just mention that E3 has been deeply involved in the resource adequacy and capacity accreditation space over the past really 5 to 10 years. We have teams that have supported and currently supporting capacity accreditation and resource adequacy reform efforts in MISO and in PJM. We have supported the New York ISO, the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and are currently supporting ERCOT on their sort of quasi-capacity mechanism, the performance credit mechanism. And Zach Ming, who's going to speak after me, Senior Director at E3, has led most of those efforts, in addition to a number of studies of sort of how to meet resource adequacy needs across as the system changes over time on the way to 2050. So with that, I'm going to dive in. I'm going to maybe take a little bit of a step back. I think we heard a lot of technical information from the first 2 presentations, which were great. But I'm going to maybe take a step back and ask the question of why we're doing this, and how we've done it a little bit in the past, and how our methods for doing resource adequacy and resource accreditation will need to change as our system changes, as our portfolio changes. So why do we need a resource adequacy construct? We need it because resource adequacy is fundamentally an externality. And what does that mean? It's an externality because it's something that the market wouldn't necessarily procure on its own. There's not necessarily, you can't assume that the market will procure enough capacity that it will always be able to clear even under the most extreme conditions. Now, normally in a normal market, when the price goes up, then demand goes down and the market clears. It may clear at a high price, but if demand is price sensitive, then the demand will go down enough that the market will be able to clear. But there are structural barriers to this market clearing. Particularly, there are price caps on our wholesale electricity markets. Many of our end-use consumers are just not price sensitive. They don't even see the prices because they're paying retail electricity rates, which are insensitive to time varying conditions on the real system. So there are a number of structural barriers as to why this market can't clear and won't clear on its own under especially the most extreme load and weather conditions. So it's an externality, and because it's an externality, we need to have a regulatory solution to ensure that there is sufficient capacity to meet all of the demand, even during those most extreme conditions, and that's what a resource adequacy construct is for. Now, and really, just about every market, just about every utility system has had some form of reserve margin resource adequacy construct to ensure that enough capacity is built. The more that we can do this on a regional level, the more benefits we can derive from resource and load diversity across that large footprint. So today, most entities are members of some form of regional resource adequacy construct, including the ISO-run markets. In the West, we're working on the Western Resource Adequacy Program, which would provide similar load and resource diversity benefits across our Western footprint, even though there's not a full-fledged or organized capacity market in that region. So the ISOs run RA markets to To solve this externality, these markets provide the primary signal for investment in new resource adequacy capacity. So they're really important to send the right price signal to induce efficient investment in the new resources that are needed to meet our reliability and resource adequacy requirements. They do this by first establishing a loss of load standard. Then they use that to calculate the need. And we've already talked about this, and I'll talk about this some more as we go through it. They allocate that need to individual market participants, load-serving entities or LSEs. Each load-serving entity is then responsible for procuring enough capacity to meet its share of the system-wide need. They do that using resources who have been accredited by the ISO. So it's important that the ISO will be the entity that does the resource accreditation so that when it adds up all of the capacity and all of the load at the end of the process, it can ensure that there's enough capacity. Capacity is greater than load plus the reserve margin. Now, that's the role of the ISO. States can regulate how LSEs meet their allocated need using the ISO accounting rules. So the ISO is not going to tell you you have to buy storage, you have to buy gas, you have to buy solar. It's just going to say the accredited quantity that you buy has to add up to your share. But then the states can go about determining how those LSEs ought to meet their requirements, which are handed down from the ISO. So that's just a little bit of background. So how the state and really federal jurisdiction overlap and relate to each other in this space. And I'm just going to say at the outset, we've heard a little bit about this debate between marginal and average ELCC methods. I think the debate is largely settled by now, but just to reiterate that if the primary purpose of a capacity market is to provide incentives for market entry and exit, and if we want that entry and exit to be economically efficient, then we have to be measuring the ability of resources that are entering the market to improve our overall system reliability. In other words, we have to use a marginal accreditation framework to achieve efficient entry and exit. There may be other considerations like equity among different LSEs, but that's a secondary purpose, and we should recognize that that purpose is in conflict with the market efficiency goal, which is really what our markets are intended to accomplish. So the way that we evaluate resource adequacy need is through loss of load probability modeling. We've already heard a lot of detail about that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I'm just going to note at a high level that you should think about loss of load modeling as an organized way to look at a whole variety of different weather conditions and evaluate the ability of the system to meet load across that whole range of weather conditions. That's basically what loss of load modeling is. We take all of the weather that we can reasonably expect to occur in the future, including the distribution and all of the tail conditions. We simulate the ability of our power system to meet load across all those conditions. It has to have not just the weather, it has to have load and wind and solar that are weather correlated. It has to have a reasonable representation of the physical characteristics of the generators that are available to meet those loads, including if there are, with multi-hour constraints, for example, on battery storage, it needs to have a reasonable representation of the ability of battery storage to change its dispatch during different hours and charge during some hours and discharge during other hours. This question about how much operational detail, ramp rates and start times and everything else. The more accurate the operational model can be, the better your estimates of ELCCs will be. I'll just say it needs to be reasonable because there's some trade-off, obviously, between the ability to operate to simulate the nth degree of detail and practical considerations like just model runtime and computer time, et cetera. So we use this loss of load model in kind of a three-step process. First, we develop a really robust and hopefully very, very accurate data set. This is increasingly challenging, as we'll discuss, because the weather is changing under our feet, and we can see that in the data. So we need to have some method of altering or thinking about what the weather trends or climate trends are doing to our weather data over time. But we first assemble an accurate data set. We then do a whole bunch of simulations to identify the quantity of what we call perfect capacity that would be needed to achieve the desired level of reliability. I'm just going to use 0.1 days per year of loss of load, 1 day in 10 years throughout my presentation, but recognizing that there's lots of other ways that you could measure that and lots of debate about whether that's the right method or what other metrics can be used. We should just think of this as these events should be very rare. And then starting from that system, then that's calibrated to meet our loss of load standard. It's at criterion, as Genna mentioned. We then calculate what the marginal contribution would be of specific resource types towards helping us meet that need. And that's kind of the multi-step process to get all the way through to the accreditation, which is what you need at the end. So just again, the first step is to calculate the total need. The function for the total need will look like that function that you see on the right there. As you add more capacity, you're moving out along the x-axis. The expected amount of loss of load will decline, so that it'll have a downward sloping shape. And the idea is to find, what's the right balance between the expense of adding more capacity and the benefits of reducing loss of load. Again, 1 day in 10 years is typically what the industry uses, but it doesn't have to. There may be other methods that are useful. Then you can take that total resource need and derive from it a planning reserve margin. You do that by taking the total need, and you typically subtract out the median peak, and then you divide that by the median peak. Median meaning sort of expected or 1 and 2 average peak. And you get a reserve margin. It might be 10 or 15 or 20%, something in that range. You should recognize that the reserve margin is a derivative calculation. It's the key numbers are the total need and the median peak load. It's helpful to have a reserve margin so that you can estimate what your need might be without having to go through a whole series of complicated loss of load calculations. But it's a derivative calculation that it itself doesn't determine the need. It's derived from the analysis that determines the need. I think it's well understood by now that when you look at resources that are available to help meet the need, that some of the variable and dispatch limited resources have declining marginal effectiveness as you add more, and some diversity benefits when you add them in combination. And so I've got a couple of slides just to illustrate those effects. But I think it's pretty easy to understand that the more solar you add, the less challenges you have meeting load during the middle of the day. And we're already seeing in California and then the Southwest that it's really after sundown is when we have the hardest time meeting our load. A similar effect occurs for battery storage, and Kevin kind of already illustrated this, that a little bit of very short duration batteries can be very effective, but then as soon as you've added those, you have to go to longer and longer durations in order to have the same marginal effectiveness. And so the marginal ELCC of batteries also declines as you add more of it. But then if you add solar and battery storage in combination, they actually are complementary to each other, such that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And this occurs not because solar is charging batteries necessarily, but it's because of the diurnal shape of the solar output and the load shape. So if you have a whole lot of solar such that you really don't have any problem meeting load during daylight hours, sunlight hours, that really compresses the window in which you need battery storage to be able to discharge. So you can see in the middle, if you're just using battery storage and it's trying to clip the peak during the middle of the day, you need to have a lot of duration. If you add solar, then you only need to worry really about kind of 6 to 10 p.m. or maybe 7 to 10 p.m. And so it really enhances the effectiveness of batteries at helping to meet that residual remaining peak after you've already clipped a lot of solar. So in this example, you can see that the solar by itself gives you 5.2 gigawatts. The storage by itself gives you 8.3. When you add them all up, you actually get 15.2. So there's an extra 1.7 gigawatts of diversity benefit that you get from the combination of solar and storage. And it turns out there's not really any accurate or unique way to allocate that additional 1.7 gigawatts of benefits between solar and storage. It's necessarily arbitrary. It's really the combination of the two. It's not just one or the other. which is the one thing that should give you a red flag about an average ELCC, because any averaging would necessarily has to use an arbitrary method of allocating that diversity benefit among the resources that are contributing to it. So here's just some additional examples of interactive effects among different resource types. Looking at the bottom, storage, hydro, and demand response are kind of all competing with each other, typically for a relatively short duration response. There's a certain amount of that that's useful to the system. If you have a lot of battery storage, demand response is less valuable, and vice versa. So we call these antagonistic pairings. But then there are other examples of synergistic pairings. In particular, solar and wind tend to be synergistic or complementary, because wind tends to blow at night and it tends to blow in the winter, which is obviously the opposite profile of solar. So how do we add all of this up then? I'm going to start with kind of our simple world that we've inhabited in the past and really kind of up until now. Where, if we're really only using thermal resources to meet our resource adequacy needs, and if they all kind of more or less look alike, if there are small differences in their forced outage rates, there aren't really any interactions among these resources. So what we could do in this kind of a simple system is just kind of add up, all the nameplate capacity from all of the resources, throw in a reserve margin to account for the fact that sometimes not all the resources are available due to forced outage. But then, just add up the nameplate, make sure it's greater than your load plus your reserve margin, and you're good to go. So that's what's represented by the bottom left equation there. It's just a simple sum of the nameplate capacity of all of the generators. We call this the installed capacity, or ICAP method, and it was used for decades by most of the system operators. It was always a bit of a simplification, and we recognize that. And so people have moved toward UCAP, which takes into consideration resource-specific forced outage rates. So it adds one step of complexity to this, but it still is largely just a sum. But we've already seen that there are now interactions among resources, and there are now large differences in resource availability during key hours. So we can't really use this linear sum anymore as our way of representing and the contribution of resources toward that need. We now have a situation in which the total amount of capacity that we get from our portfolio of resources, the portfolio ELCC, is a complex function of all of the resources that are available on the system and the interactions among those resources. So the concepts that are similar, but we just need to enhance our modeling capabilities and the way that we think about these interactions to sort of move this framework into the modern world with our new resource types. And so the way that we should think about this is the portfolio ELCC, as I mentioned, is a function of all of the resources on the system. If we think about how our portfolio ELCC changes as a function of the installed capacity of one resource type, that's what's shown on the right there. And if you think about this as solar on the x-axis, then we've already seen that as you add solar to the system, that the marginal effectiveness declines. That's why this curve this function has kind of a curved shape. If you look down close to the origin on the bottom left, the first amount of solar, the line's pretty steep there, so it gives you a lot of effective capacity. As you add more and more, it tends to flatten out, just reflecting the diminishing effectiveness. The line here, the height of the line is the portfolio ELCC, the total amount of capacity that you get from all of your resources in the portfolio. But what we're interested in with respect to each individual resource is how much it's helping us meet our total need. And again, we need to understand this on the margin, based on the portfolio that we already have existing. If I make changes to that, how does that change my total need? And mathematically, that's the partial derivative of the portfolio ELCC function with respect to a change in one dimension, and that dimension would be of a specific resource type. So that's kind of the mathematical derivation of what this marginal ELCC is. it's impossible for us to know the functional form of this surface. All we can really do is kind of take measurements of the marginal ELCC at different points along the surface. And we should think of this, it's a bit like taking sonar readings of like the seafloor from a ship. We can't observe it directly. We can take readings of it so we know what the slope of the line is at various different points. And our task as market operators and resource planners is to map out the portions of this surface that are important for our resource decisions. So we need to know the marginal ELCCs of different resources in the part of the surface where the decisions are being made. So given my current portfolio and the next set of resources that I want to add to it, I want to understand how much those resources are helping me to meet my total need. And so those are the marginal ELCC measurements that I'm going to take along that surface. So, back to the slide to a couple of slides ago when we talked about the previous world being kind of a simple sum of the installed capacity, that was always a simplification. And it was always the case that no resource is a perfect resource. All resources have, some factors that prevent them from being available when you might really need them. With wind and solar, the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining. With battery storage, it's because you don't have enough duration to perform at your nameplate level for all of the hours that you need. With natural gas or coal or oil resources or nuclear, it might be because your resource is offline. It was forced out of service due to a forced outage. It may be because you weren't able to get fuel. If you don't have firm transportation capacity for your pipeline, your fuel supply might be curtailed during a reliability event, and you might not be able to perform as a result of that. So a variety of reasons, and it's important again if we're trying to make efficient decisions about what additional resources to add to the portfolio. It's important for us to use a marginal framework for all resources so that we create a level playing field, and so that we're accurately factoring in how each of those resources can help our total system meet our total need. So we are big advocates of an ELCC for all approach. And we think that as Zach will talk about, the direct LOL approach that MISO is taking is basically a form of this. I'll just mention that sort of some of the other terms that Genna mentioned, the equivalent perfect capacity, the marginal reliability improvement. These are all just different ways to measure marginal ELCC. So we think those are all sort of good, and there are different sort of just measurement techniques, but they're all trying to measure, back to this chart, the slope of that line at very specific points to help us understand how those resources are helping us meet our total need. And then since we're using a marginal ELCC for each of the individual resources to understand the total amount of capacity that we need, we use what's called an equivalent perfect capacity or perfect capacity or PCAP type of an approach for the accounting of the total need, as opposed to like an installed capacity or an unforced capacity type of an approach. So how much perfect capacity would we need? And then how do each of these individual resources compare to that perfect capacity? And if we add them all up, do we have enough perfect capacity equivalent to meet our loss of load standard? So this, I guess, I'll just maybe go back to here and just note that this is the approach that market operators would take when evaluating the accredited capacity of individual resource types for use in a capacity auction or in some type of bilateral capacity construct like the RAP will have in the West. So this is kind of the application of this, and Zach will talk about this in a lot of detail, that the application of this in the market construct is that you use the marginal ELCC values to clear the auction, and those auctions happen on a periodic basis. So as the portfolio moves, the marginal ELCCs will get updated so that you're always measuring the marginal contribution of all of the different resource types, given the portfolio that you have at the time. There are additional applications of this in the resource planning space, and I want to take just a minute to talk about those applications. And this is particularly, well, there's those two kind of categories. So let me just start by noting that most utilities use long-term capacity expansion models, LTCE, or capacity expansion modeling, to evaluate different portfolios of resources within their IRP context. And all of those models will have some form of resource adequacy constraint that constrains the portfolio optimization to ensure that there's enough capacity to meet the resource adequacy needs. And that's kind of in that first sub bullet where the accredited total capacity is greater than or equal to the total need. And there are kind of two cases for utilities in their IRPs. If the utility is in an organized market, then as we talked about at the beginning of my presentation, all of the parameters for the resource adequacy need and the resource accreditation will be determined by the market operator. So for those utilities, what they really need is a forecast of how much need will be allocated to them from the market operator, and a forecast of the ELCC values that will be used in the capacity auctions over the next, X number of years, 10, 15, 20 years, the lifetime of the resources that they're considering. So it's really not a function of their own power systems because they're part of a larger regional construct. Their resource adequacy need is determined by the market. And so they need to understand, of all the resources that they're considering, how will those resources be accredited over time? So they need to use a forecast of that so that they can appropriately value those resources relative to each other in meeting their own energy, clean energy and other needs within an IRP context. If the utilities are not in organized markets, then they'll need to conduct this type of loss of load modeling for their own systems and do their own calculations of total need and their own calculations of ELCC values, accrediting resources at meeting their own need. So all of the things that we just talked about, market operators do it for their broad footprints. If utilities aren't in a market, they need to do that for their own footprints. Now, when you're doing capacity expansion modeling, you might need to consider a broader range of portfolios than are considered in a market auction. So in a MISO auction, for example, it's a 1-year auction. There's going to be another one next year. I'm really only buying capacity 1 year at a time. So what I'm really concerned about is what's the marginal ELCC of a whole bunch of different resource types with respect to the portfolio that I have now and 1 year worth of potential changes to it. If I'm doing capacity expansion over many years, 20 years or 30 years, I need to have a much larger portion of those ELCC surfaces mapped out. So I might need to do mapping of a larger area, and I might need to incorporate that mapping as a surface into my long-term capacity expansion model to ensure that as I add lots and lots of solar and lots of storage, that I'm capturing both the saturation effects and the diversity benefits of adding those resources individually and in combination. And so that's kind of the trick or the technique for these utilities is to do a lot of ELCC runs. I probably have a coarser representation of the ELCC surface because I'm trying to cover a large area and I can't do an infinite number of runs. But I need to have some way of understanding how all those resources fit together and how the saturation reduces their ability to meet loss of load over time. And I should use a marginal ELCC for all resources as well. So going back to the idea that no capacity is perfect, we should use marginal ELCCs to make sure that we're creating a level playing field among solar, storage, wind, fuel combusting resources with backup fuel, without it, just all the variety of different resource types need to be measured on a level playing field, and a marginal ELCC approach is the best way to do that. And that includes for demand side resources like demand response. I need to understand how those are like or different from battery storage, and how adding lots of demand response changes the value of battery storage. Because those resources, again, really kind of compete with each other for that relatively short duration service. Just a couple of concluding points here. One thing I want to note is that really the resource adequacy requirement is kind of unrelated almost entirely to environmental policy. And this is true mathematically because capacity products are denominated in megawatts, and they typically don't have runtime requirements. And so I can have a resource. It may be a very dirty, highly emitting, highly polluting resource. But if it doesn't run very often, then the environmental damage from it might be much less than a very efficient and low emitting resource that runs all the time. So we need to separate this idea of capacity from runtime, megawatts from megawatt hours, when thinking about the environmental consequences of capacity decisions. And I'll just state this boldly here, that there is no such thing as clean capacity. Clean or dirty only happens when the resource runs. So it's only the megawatt hours that determine how the emissions and whether a resource is dirty or clean. And, just to give you a sense of that, so battery storage, a lot of people think of that as being clean capacity, but for the next 20 years, on high loss of load probability days, peak load days, very challenging days, there won't be surplus clean energy to charge those batteries. So today and for the foreseeable future, batteries will be charging from emitting resources when they're helping us to avoid loss of load during very extreme and challenging days. So even batteries aren't necessarily clean capacity, because if they're charging from emitting resources and there's losses from charging batteries and then discharging, they are contributing to emissions, even if they aren't emitting directly at the power plant site. So we just need to separate those ideas of capacity from energy. And it's really the energy generation that creates the environmental impact, not the capacity by itself. And then lastly, just a little bit of a highlight of some of the challenges that practitioners of these methods are facing, just given all the various aspects, challenges that we have today. So some of the questions that are being discussed are, what is an appropriate reliability standard? Nobody likes the 1 day and 10-year standard. Some people say it's far too onerous. It doesn't match up. The cost of meeting it is much higher than measured values of lost load from customers. And so, maybe it's too stringent. I'll just note that it seems like whenever we have one of these events, we end up with a lot of political interference in energy markets that itself can create just very costly and inefficient outcomes. And so I'm not sure if it's stringent enough, but there's a debate about that, and it's a debate that we should be having and continue to have. How can we get more price responsive demand into the market to help us avoid the need for steel in the ground? Adapting weather for climate change, as I talked about, the weather is changing. It's changing measurably and noticeably in our data sets. And it's very easy to draw a trend line using the data that we have, so that trend is going to continue. So how do we modify our data so that we're capturing expected future conditions and not just conditions from 20 years ago that are less likely to repeat in the future? Addressing fuel limitations in thermal accreditation is another sort of hot topic, especially after Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott, when we saw basically some resources couldn't get fuel, they couldn't perform, and we had loss of load events or very near loss of load events as a result of that. That's a significant issue that a lot of people are working on. So I think with that, I'm done with my prepared remarks. And let me see if there are some Q&As.
Arne, I'm happy to read them out
Yeah.
if you like. Yeah. So
Sure.
we have one from Marcus Hawkins. Thanks, Marcus. For assignment of need, do you allocate the need based on historic load or need during the risky hours, or the projected need during the risky hours?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about for allocation of system-wide need to individual load serving entities. And Zach's going to talk about this a little bit in his talk as well. What we typically have done is use kind of a modeled or expected, 1 and 2 peak, and said, since the loss of load events occur during the peak load hours, what is every LSC's contribution toward that peak? And you do it kind of on a model or an expected basis. So it will take historical data into consideration, but it will set the historical data in context with the broader set of weather conditions that you might be expected to encounter in the future. Because our loss of load hours are changing as the system portfolio changes, Zach's going to say that we should be moving from a contribution to gross peak to contribution to net peak, as not just the time of year, the time period to evaluate the capacity contribution of generators, but also for allocating load to the individual LSEs, so that we're sending the right price signal to loads as well.
Great. And then we have another, if batteries are charged using emitting resources, why not just use the emitting resource instead of charging the batteries for peak loads? Is there not a loss across the system for charging them from fossil? Is the sum of fossil used to charge in this composite system less than relying on solely on using them in the first place?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Let me just first talk about what a loss of load day looks like. So on that day, there may be combined cycle power plants that have excess capability. They might not be called upon to run, like, let's say at night before, while loads are still low. So you might be charging batteries from a combined cycle plant at night. And then when you get into the really, highest load periods of the day, it's going to be all hands on deck. So it might be, simple cycle combustion turbines. It might be old steam turbines that are highly inefficient. It might even be diesel generators that are being called upon to run, to meet load on one of these really, really challenging days. So it's always something really dirty that you're displacing. And if you're charging from something that's cleaner, there may be emission benefits even on that day. But then taking a step back and thinking about storage as a grid resource, it's doing a lot of things besides just on that day. So in California, we have a lot of hours in the springtime where solar is being curtailed. And during those hours, batteries are charging from solar that would otherwise just have been curtailed, and they're discharging at night and really extending the ability of solar to meet more and more hours of load at zero emissions. So during other times of the year, they're charging from solar and they're discharging against gas and having very large emission benefits. It happens that on a peak day, those benefits are less. But again, the emissions, we should remember that the emissions are really all about what happens during all 8,760 hours. And even if everything's running and everything's emitting for 1 hour of the year, those emissions aren't going to add up to all of that much. So we shouldn't worry too much about the emissions on that one peak day.
Great. Well, thanks again, Arne. Terrific information, and really appreciate it. We are right on schedule now, and so we'll carry on here. We'll go to Zachary Ming. Zach, you can pull up your slides, and while you do that, I'll go ahead and introduce you here. Zach Ming is a director in E3's resource planning practice, with an emphasis on the reliability of highly renewable electric systems. He has extensive experience in regulatory and rate design issues, distributed resource cost effectiveness, and market design. Mr. Ming has been the lead author on several high-profile studies, including assessment of market reform options to enhance reliability of the ERCOT system and long-run resource adequacy under deep decarbonization pathways for California. His prior experience includes internships at General Electric, Citigroup, Oklahoma Gas and Electric, and MAP Royalty. He holds a master's in science in management science and engineering with a focus on energy and environment, as well as a bachelor's in science in civil and environmental engineering with an emphasis on atmosphere and energy, all from Stanford University. Zach, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Elliot. And I know that was a mouthful there, so apologies for all the words in my bio, but I think TLDR, I've been working with Arne for 10 years on these topics. actually working with Kevin at Astrapé for a number of years as well, and overlapped with Genna a bit too. So, and in that vein, I feel like a lot of what I'm about to talk about is very similar and overlaps with what the previous presenters have talked about from a slightly different angle. So actually, I hope that might be useful to kind of hear the same things from a different angle. Practice makes perfect on these topics. So I kind of wanted to start from a very high level here of, so primarily what I'm going to be talking about, just to back up, is what are the ISOs and the RTOs doing for capacity accreditation? And we've talked about some of the different methods that can be used, but what actually are the ISOs doing? So in order to set up an explanation for what they're doing, I kind of wanted to walk through the history of how the ISOs have been thinking about risk. So what this graphic is showing here, this is a sort of cartoonish graphic for a single day on an electricity system. You can see this is a load profile here that starts low, gets high, goes back down at the end of the day. And it has a bunch of firm resources, right? So things like coal, natural gas, nuclear, etc. On this traditional system, you can see that the reliability risks exist when loads get really high. And that's what is called peak load. You can see here, that's when the loss of load risk or the reliability risk is. And because this is what the traditional electricity system looked like, everything that electricity markets did was oriented around the peak load. So we set requirements for, we need to buy enough capacity to meet the peak, plus a planning reserve margin, but it was all oriented around the peak. And in this construct, from a capacity accreditation perspective, what you really cared about was what's the availability of resources during the peak, right? Because that was the challenging period. And so historically, right, going back a decade plus ago, most capacity accreditation was just focused around what is the availability of resources during the peak. As we know, this is not what our electricity system looks like anymore. We have an increasing penetration of renewables and storage, and all of a sudden this graph starts to get a little bit more complicated. So what we've done here is take the same day, the same load profile, we've added a bunch of renewables to it, that's the green. And this is what we've done here is a mix of wind and solar. So you can see that the biggest availability of renewables is actually in the middle of the day when solar is producing. And the difference between this gross load and the renewables is net load, which is the dashed line. And so a couple of things fall out of this chart right here, but in addition to adding renewables, we've also added storage, which is the other sort of flavor of resource that's rapidly increasing in penetration on the system. And what you can see is that storage is dispatching in the evening. That's when the system most needs energy for reliability purposes and economics, and so that's when storage is dispatching. And the two things that fall out of this chart right here that are different than the previous chart when everything was concentrated, all of the risk was concentrated in the peak, is that that's no longer when the risk on the system is. In fact, if you look at the actual peak, which still is the exact same middle of the afternoon, it's actually not a very risky hour because we have a lot of renewables on the system at that time. There's an abundance of solar energy in the middle of the afternoon, and that's just not a risky period. The risky period on this system has shifted later in the day as the sun has set. And then similar to what Arne talked about in the way that storage helps meet that peak, you can see that the peak is no longer a single peak hour, but it's a flat peak period. And that's because as storage helps to meet the peak, it flattens the peak. And you can see that dynamic here. So the reliability risk on this system is what's highlighted as the red loss of load. And so this is roughly the problem that the ISOs are facing today. You know, every ISO is at a little bit of a different stage as to exactly how many renewables are on the system, how much storage is on the system, but this is some ISOs are already here, some are on their way. And so everybody's thinking about how can we design our markets around meeting and reliability during this new challenge that the system faces. And so that's really where we get into the 3 broad categories of resource accreditation that ISOs are using. And so what we're showing here is, again, this exact same chart from before. We've actually taken out storage just to make it simpler. And what this is showing is the 3 methods as illustrated as simply as possible for what ISOs use for resource accreditation or capacity accreditation. So the first is just looking at what is the availability of resources during the peak. And so if we look at this system right here, we can see the peak, the gross peak, the top of that chart is in the middle of the afternoon. If we just measure the availability of a resource during that specific hour, we can get something like availability of peak. And 10 years ago, this is what ISOs were doing to measure the capacity accreditation of renewables. They were just looking at during the peak. And when you have very small penetrations of renewables, that makes sense. But what's the problem with this method? The problem is that you can quickly see here that this is not a good indicator of its overall contribution to reliability, because you could have a system where you just build a bunch of solar and you can meet all of your peak needs in the middle of the day. But then as soon as the sun sets, you still have all of this reliability risk. And so you've just looking at what a resource is doing during the single peak hour is not indicative of its overall contribution to reliability and how much it can mitigate the needs for other reliability resources. And so in recognizing this shortcoming, planners started to move to this concept of average ELCC, which you see illustrated here as number 2. And at its most basic level, what an average ELCC is looking at is the difference between the gross peak and the net peak. In other words, if you have no renewables, you need enough dispatchable generation to meet your gross peak. If you do have renewables, you need enough dispatchable generation to meet your net peak. And so in aggregate, renewables are providing or mitigating the need for dispatchable generation that's equal to something like an average ELCC. And this is actually a method that PJM was using until very recently. A couple months ago, FERC approved a new method, marginal ELCC, for them. But this is actually a method that PJM was using. This is a method that different vertically integrated utilities have looked at as well. And it does make a little bit of intuitive sense when you just look at it, as I just spoke through it. But as Arne talked about, there's really 2 primary issues with average ELCC. The biggest one is that it sends the wrong incentives, wrong economic incentives for resources to enter and exit the market. Because you could have a resource that is being sent a signal that, yes, you are valuable because there are other resources on the system that look like you that have helped reduce the peak. And it says, okay, economic signal, enter the market. But in fact, you're not incrementally improving reliability at all if you don't have any marginal incremental benefit to reliability. An average ELCC is not able to capture a resource's marginal incremental benefit to reliability. And so the primary issue with average ELCC is that it does not send appropriate signals for entry and exit. And ultimately, when you're sending signals for resources to enter the market that are not economic, that is overall increasing consumer costs at the end of the day, because somebody's paying for those resources and the market has to distort itself to make sure that it achieves reliability. And so as people began to realize this distortion, and I'll just quickly say the other problem with average ELCC is that when you are still planning everything around a gross peak construct, which is what average ELCC does, right? You can see here that the sum of all of the firm dispatchable resources plus the average renewable resources, that's all adding up to the gross peak. When you still keep planning everything around a gross peak and you use that as the basis for clearing the market and allocating capacity costs, you also send the wrong signals to loads. you send a signal to loads that says, don't use more energy during the gross peak because you're going to increase capacity needs and increase the amount of capacity that you have to buy. The problem with that is that if, in fact, we have an abundance of energy during the gross peak, which in this case we do, we actually want people to use energy during the gross peak. It's not a binding period. And in fact, it could be a very low emission period. I live in California, and there's a huge effort in California to get people to charge their electric vehicles in the middle of the day, because that's when the sun is shining. We have abundant, cheap, low emission energy. And we do not want to be sending a signal that says doing something that's beneficial for the system is going to increase your amount of capacity that you need to buy, because it's not increasing, it's not creating reliability problems, and we don't want to be sending a false signal that it is. So in recognizing both of those issues, the industry has begun to coalesce around what has already been introduced as marginal ELCC. And fundamentally, at the most simple level, marginal ELCC is what is the availability of resources during the most challenging hour. And the most challenging hour in this graph right here is the net peak hour. So you can look at every resource and say, what is its availability during that hour? That's its marginal ELCC. Because adding more of any resource will help alleviate the reliability challenges and loss of load risk that exists within that hour. So those are the three broad categories of resource accreditation. I'll talk through what the ISOs are doing. I will briefly mention that there are two wildcards that aren't quite following these broad categories. It's what Texas is doing and it's what California is doing. I'm going to talk through both of those. Texas, as Arne said, is doing the performance credit mechanism, or PCM. California is doing slice of day. Even though they don't exactly fall under one of these broad categories, they actually do economically look a lot like marginal ELCC. They get to pretty close to the same outcome. So I think that's just something worth highlighting, and we'll talk through that. But a couple more slides before I get into who's doing what. I did just want to go a little bit deeper on marginal, number 3 here, because that's where everyone's heading. I just want to make sure that it's sort of abundantly clear what's happening in a marginal ELCC framework. As I said, a marginal ELCC framework is looking at during the highest risk hours, which are not the peak hours, what are the needs of the system and what is the availability of resources. And so this is illustrating on a system with a bunch of renewables and a bunch of storage, when are the risk hours? You can see here that's the loss of load hours, and you can see the time period that those risk hours exist. The average load, that's the total reliability requirement of this system. So in a capacity market, which is what an ISO is operating, the total capacity requirement is that bar, the total reliability requirement. That's how much capacity is being purchased. And the amount of capacity accreditation that each resource type is able to sell into the market, that's what's illustrated here as your average availability during that exact same time period. So renewable resource accreditation, that's just your average availability during the reliability risk hours, which are the loss of load hours. Same for storage, same for thermal. So again, this is a highly stylized example, but what this is showing is really the capacity markets that ISOs are operating. What's the total requirement that's being cleared through those markets, and what is the accreditation for each resource type that it can participate in those markets. So one of the very interesting things that falls out of this illustration right here that you probably are noticing is that the total reliability requirement is lower than the gross peak. And I think this is probably the strangest thing to wrap your head around as you start to think about and conceptualize a marginal ELCC framework in a capacity market. And in fact, many people have said, oh, this means something's obviously wrong. We're not going to have enough capacity. No, in fact, what it means is that we don't need to worry about the peak anymore because we have an abundance of energy, and what we're procuring reliability for is the times in which we're actually worried about reliability, which is not the gross peak. It's a later time of day. or a different season, depends on your system. And this observation of the total reliability requirement being lower than the peak is not something that just exists in theory. This is a very cartoonish graph, but it's actually something that's being observed in actual ISOs that are running marginal capacity frameworks. So for example, if you just look at this graph here on the right, this is showing PJM and some of their recent information that they've published around their impending move to a marginal ELCC framework. And you can see that the total amount of capacity they're going to procure is lower than the gross peak. And again, all that means is that the time periods that they're procuring capacity for are not the gross peak hours, because they have an abundance of energy during the gross peak. Those are not reliability constrained time periods. They're procuring capacity for other hours that are definitionally lower hours, lower load hours, but they're higher reliability risk. And that's when the system needs capacity, and that's how the total amount of capacity that's going to be procured, and the time periods with which resources are accredited based on their availability during those hours. So all of that is a setup to the main punchline, which is, what is everybody actually doing? And so what I have here is just a map of all the ISOs in the country, what they have been doing, what they're doing as we speak, and what they're planning to do in the future. And this is such a live topic, it's almost hard to keep up with. You know, MISO literally filed last week a move to a marginal ELCC framework. PJM filed theirs, similar to FERC, the end of last year. It was approved early this year. So this is a highly live issue. SPP has a filing that's being contested with FERC right now. So things are changing on a really week by week basis. But I did just kind of want to walk through at a high level what's happening at the different ISOs. So let's first focus on the ones that are moving to a marginal framework. Those are the three that we've highlighted here. So the very first ISO that has said, yes, we're going to a marginal ELCC framework was NISO. They made that filing in late 2022, and it was approved by FERC shortly thereafter, and they are well on their way to a marginal ELCC capacity accreditation framework. And it works functionally exactly like I illustrated on the prior slides. So they were really a very early mover, ahead of the pack. PJM made a filing late last year in October. They received approval early this year. And so they are well on their way to running their next capacity auction using a marginal framework, setting requirements based not on gross load, but on net load, looking at resource accreditation based on their availability during the net load hours. So PJM, that's the direction they're moving. They've, again, received approval. And the third ISO is MISO, which, as I said just last week, submitted their filing to FERC to move to a marginal ELCC framework. They have not yet received approval, but I would likely expect that seems more likely than not, given that FERC has approved it into other ISOs. So there's definitely a precedent for saying that this is a just and reasonable market design. And in fact, E3 did support MISO as the expert witness in that filing to FERC, kind of outlining why a marginal capacity framework is economically efficient and fair and tractable. And you can read our testimony if you'd like to look into more details on that. So that's at a high level the ISOs that are moving to a marginal ELCC framework. I did just want to talk a bit about the way in which they're moving to a marginal ELCC framework. There is this kind of budding consensus around how to do this in a tractable way. And I'm not going to go into tons of details here, but at a high level, the way in which all of the ISOs are doing marginal ELCC calculations is by grouping resources into classes, which are almost always defined based on technology types. You have a wind class, a solar class, a storage class. You calculate a marginal ELCC value for that individual class, And that's kind of the starting point for every resource in that class. And then you can look at historical data and say, okay, during the historical periods that mattered, were resources within that class more or less available? And then you can use that as a basis for allocating more or less of that resource's value to certain individual resources. So why are people using this approach where you calculate a single value for the class and then do some adjustments based on historical data? The primary reason is that it's more tractable for the system operator and it's more transparent for the actual resources. They can have good visibility into what their class is going to do, and they can have good explanation for why am I being, bumped up or bumped down relative to other resources in my class. Oh, it's because I was more or less available during the time periods that the system needed me. And all of the 3 ISOs that I said are moving to a marginal framework. They all call it something different a little bit, right? New York calls it the quote, marginal reliability improvement. PJM actually just calls it marginal ELCC. MISO is calling it the direct loss of load or DLOL method, not to be confused with the LOL method. Just kidding. But these, even though they have different names, they are all functionally the same thing. They're all marginal ELCC. So those are the ISOs that are moving to an marginal ELCC framework. I just want to call it a couple of ISOs that are also have very live proceedings. So ISO New England has previously indicated that it wants to move to a marginal ELCC framework. They have been doing a lot of work, particularly around modeling. They've run into some challenges there. So this is something that's been gotten delayed on their side. And, they do They have some unique challenges in New England, particularly getting fuel to generators during winter cold snaps. So that is a real challenge that needs to be reflected in their modeling. And that's one of the issues that has led to their delays. So they've indicated that they want to move to a marginal ELCC framework. They haven't exactly done it yet or made a filing with FERC, but that's a process that's underway and that they're working very hard on. SPP, middle of the country, they actually just made a filing with FERC to update their capacity accreditation. They are not, at least based on their latest filing, proposing to move to a marginal ELCC framework. They are proposing to essentially move to an average ELCC framework for renewables and storage, and then accredit thermal resources based on an average forced outage rate. So, I think this is a very live issue for them, and there has been some stakeholder pushback, including from the renewable community, that this might actually be overvaluing thermal resources, which I'll talk a little bit about thermal at the very end of the presentation. But I think this is an open question as to what exactly is going to happen in SPP. So I mentioned there were 2 wild cards, California and Texas. I want to briefly touch on those. They're not really using a pure marginal approach in either case, but they end up getting outcomes that are functionally similar. So this is illustrating what California is doing. California essentially sets requirements for every load serving entity. So it'd be like a utility or community choice aggregator that says you have to procure sufficient capacity for each month-hour slice of the year. So there's 12 months, there's 24 hours a day. That's 288 different compliance products. So that's right off the bat, makes your head spin a little bit. Instead of 1 capacity compliance product, you have 288 capacity compliance products. There's also a lot of complications around how do you demonstrate compliance in a particular month-hour slice? Like, what do you assume load is in July at 2 p.m.? What do you assume solar is at July at 2 p.m.? So they've come up with these percentile worst days. That'll, it's maybe theoretically possible to calibrate those to something reasonable, but you end up kind of bending backwards and upright and backwards again, because, what a worst day for load is not aligned with a worst day for solar. In California, high load days are when it's hot outside. When it's hot outside, it's sunny. So, mixing and matching high load days with low solar days, it doesn't really make sense. And I could go on and on about some of the challenges with slice of day, but suffice it to say, it's probably more complex than is necessary. It's less accurate than necessary, but if it's done reasonably, it does ultimately concentrate value in the most challenging periods of the day, which are going to be in the net peak hours, which in California right now are summer evenings. And so that is functionally the exact same signal that marginal ELCC sends. And in fact, this California Public Utilities Commission is looking at potentially even beyond slice of day, looking at a marginal ELCC framework. And there's a market design proceeding that's underway to examine those exact issues. Texas, I'll briefly touch on. They are doing what's called the performance credit mechanism. EPRI is working with ERCOT to write the detailed rules of this. I would call it kind of a backwards looking capacity-esque mechanism. It doesn't pre-accredit resources. It looks back at the year and says during the most challenging hours, which are the marginal ELCC hours, it's the hours of highest reliability risk. It says what were loads consuming, that sets the requirement to buy performance credits, and what was the availability of resources, that creates the ability to sell performance credits. So it's functionally the same thing as a marginal ELCC framework, but it's backward looking. It doesn't rely on modeling to the same extent. It looks at actual performance and gets to a pretty similar economic outcome. So with that, that's a just flyby of what's happening in all the ISOs. This is just a summary chart of everything I just talked about for what ISOs are doing now, what they're potentially headed towards. Again, this is such a live issue. It'll probably be out of date here in another week. So just keep that in mind if you're planning to put this in your library for the next few years. And before I wrap up, I did want to just talk about a couple of other issues. One is around thermal. This move towards marginal ELCC ostensibly was driven by the need to more accurately accredit renewable resources and storage resources, but it's equally as important for thermal resources. And the reason is because thermal resources, as we've seen in recent years, can suffer from highly correlated outages. When it gets cold over a region, large portions of the entire thermal fleet can fail. That does not look too dissimilar from an operational perspective than a large-scale cloud going over an entire region and making solar go away, or the wind stopping blowing over the large region. And that's what limits the reliability contribution of those resources, right? Large correlated outages. The biggest one is the sun sets every night. That's a large correlated outage for solar in the evening, for all solar everywhere. Similar impacts can be observed for thermal. And so that's why increasingly it's not sufficient to just look at average outage rates for thermal, but to look at, can these resources all fail at the same time? And how can we incorporate those risks into their modeling? That's exactly what PJM is doing. And you can see here, this is some illustrative values of how marginal ELCC values might change over time. So the capacity accreditation of different resources on the left. But if we just look on the right, this is actually some live results from PJM. And you can see that if we just scroll down here to the bottom, you can look at it, for example, a gas combustion turbine having a marginal ELCC of 62%. That means that these resources during the times in which the system most needs them are 62% available, which is a lot more available than nothing, but not anywhere close to the 100% that, traditionally we've assumed these firm resources that you can turn on are available when you need them. And that is fundamentally driven by the fact that there have been multiple time periods over the past 10 years in PJM where a third or more of the entire combustion turbine fleet has gone offline when they're most needed. Right? We've observed that in the polar vortex. We've observed that in Winter Storm Elliott, 30 to 40% fleet-wide outage rates for gas combustion turbines. And that's ultimately coming home to roost in these marginal ELCC values. So I will just talk, there's so many nuances to actually implementing these. capacity accreditation methods, one of the things that we also think is really important at E3 is having a really robust performance penalty structure. Ultimately, what that does is it takes a lot of pressure off of the modeling and upfront accreditation for renewables. If you're going to hold resources accountable for showing up as they've been accredited, it prevents resources from wanting to seek over accreditation because they know that they're going to be held financially accountable for showing up. And so having a very predictable, stable, and stringent and robust performance penalty mechanism, we think is very important to kind of take in a little bit of the pressure off of the ISOs to get capacity accreditation perfect. So that's one thing that ISOs are actively working on. There's a lot of other things that they're working on as well. These, the nuances of implementing these capacity markets is constantly changing. People are thinking about, do we want to run auctions on an annual or a seasonal basis? Do we want to do it right before the year or a couple of years in advance? How granular do we set resource classes? So these are all the things that, ISOs are thinking about in the detail. But again, this is kind of a level down from just the big picture average versus marginal ELCC that we talked about. And again, I think there is a consensus towards marginal ELCC. So I think I've gone over my time limit there. So I will stop talking and take questions or have discussion with the group. Kick it back over to Elliot.
Yeah, Zach, that was a great presentation. Really nice way to wrap it up too, because I think members on the webinar here are interested, right, in all these developments throughout the country, and that can, as you said, sort of be hard to keep track of. There's so much movement. We do have one question, and then I've got a question that I hope will kind of wrap everything up with all the panelists here. But first from Marcus, how do you ensure correlated outages are properly modeled in LOLE analysis?
So that is, I kind of segment the challenges of running a capacity market into two buckets. There's the market design elements, which is how do you design an efficient market? And, are you doing average? Are you doing marginal? And then there's the technical modeling. And there's a whole slew of issues for getting the technical modeling as robust as possible. Capturing correlated outages is in that list. There's tons of other things in that list too, right? How do you account for climate change? Making sure your loads are at right levels that might look different than historical levels. All sorts of, how do you make sure you're dispatching your resources like storage correctly? So I think it's probably a longer answer than saying like, this is how you do it. But I think, the way in which you can start to get at making sure you're preserving proper correlations is by benchmarking the outputs of the model to actual historicals and say, when solar is low, what is load doing in my model versus what has happened in the actual past, and structuring the way in which the model pairs those outcomes together in a way that makes sense. So for example, what PJM is doing is they're doing everything on a temperature basis. So they're taking load days of very cold temperatures and pairing those with what have renewables done with very cold temperatures. They're not mixing and matching, cold load days with warm solar days. So they're kind of avoiding mixing and matching things that shouldn't be mixed and matched. But I think all of the, best LOLP models like Servum, for example, all have methods to do that. They all do it slightly differently, but I think it's, absolutely something that is, I think it's actually, of all the technical challenges, something that the models are doing fairly well at the moment, but that's not to say that it can't be improved.
Well, great. We'll go ahead and spotlight the remaining, the rest of the panelists, and I hope this will kind of tie things together. Arne mentioned in his first slide the role of states in regulating how LSEs meet their respective obligations in various parts of the country, specifically the loss of load standard, and then we've seen this ESIG report that came out last week. They sort of suggested that LOLE won't really go away per se, but might be supplemented by other metrics like EUE or perhaps a multi-metric approach. And I'm wondering about the dynamics or the relationships between all these different approaches for capacity accreditation, and more broadly, the resource adequacy criteria. Do you all see these risks with different approaches sort of as we move towards the later stages of the energy transition? Do you see different approaches in different areas kind of coming to head, perhaps inconsistencies in how resources are accounted for? Or, you know, in 10 to 15 years, maybe they'll sort of converge, kind of like what happened perhaps with like marginal versus average ELCC, which used to be debatable, and as y'all mentioned, is kind of not anymore. So do you see the same sort of thing happening with all these different, you know, approaches in different parts of the country, different proposals?
I mean, I'll take a crack at that. So there's the marginal versus average, which we've discussed that. But then you say, okay, well, how do you calculate a marginal ELCC? Is it based on the marginal improvement to expected unserved energy, to days of loss of load? And if you do different approaches there, you're going to get different answers. And so then you say, well, what's driving those different answers? What's driving it is not a difference in accreditation method. It's a difference in the choice for how you set your reliability standard. So setting a reliability standard, both the metric that each ISO chooses to set, as well as the stringency with which they set that standard, is still fundamentally a subjective choice. And as long as you allow, and there's really no way around that, right? You have to set a metric and say, this is my metric. And if two jurisdictions subjectively choose different standards or metrics, their ability of resources to contribute to those metrics are going to be different. And that's probably a feature, not a bug, of what capacity accreditation is measuring.
Yeah, and I'll just offer, I don't see them necessarily converging either. I mean, a lot of the work that we do across the country, different entities have different resource mixes, different load shapes, different seasonal risks, and all those things somewhat drive to the need for a different reliability metric. So a system that's summer peaking, that has all of its reliability risk concentrated in the summer, its events are kind of by definition going to be shorter in duration, not as deep as well. And so using an EUE metric for that system may not be as applicable for a system like the Southeast, where it's primarily winter risk and you have really long, really deep events. We need to make sure that we don't expose ourselves to 12-hour events or 30% of the load being shed at one point in time. So the LOLE from those two metrics, they set them differently. They got their own standard. If we were to compare LOLE, we could have very different LOLE, and that may make sense. We still want to meet the 1 day in 10 standard in California, for instance. But in the Southeast, we've got to move to this duration depth constraint, or in Texas, we may need to move to that. And that may entail being better than 1 day in 10, being at 0.05, because we've got to measure to this standard. So I don't necessarily seeing them converge for some of those reasons.
I tend to agree, and I think that's what we've been advocating for at EPRI as well, as almost, I think we converged to an LOE of 0.1 just because everyone was sort of, that's what their neighbor was doing, but we're actually wanting to advocate for a little bit more intentionality there in terms of how you choose your metrics and your criteria, so that it is specific and appropriate for your system. And I will say, I think one of the things that the ESIG report touched on is the idea of multiple metrics and how that might feed into your accreditation mechanisms. And just because you have multiple risk metrics doesn't necessarily mean they'll all be binding. There might be some periods or some years where one of those might be binding and not another. So that's not necessarily an issue there, I think, when you move into the capacity accreditation phase of things.
I agree with the ESIG report that you should look at multiple metrics. I think you just want to have good information about what the nature of the reliability problem is that you're trying to solve. And if you just look at it from one metric, you might be missing information. You do need to choose one, though, to set your standard. So look at a bunch of them, pick one, Pick one that's well behaved, pick one that you think is representative, pick a standard that's the right trade-off between more investment and more loss of load. There's no right answer. But then you want to accredit resources based on that metric so that they really are helping you meet that metric on the margin. I don't think we see a big difference like today or even in the next 10 or 15 years between all the different metrics. Over time, we do observe that as you have more resources that are producing energy during times when you might not need it and less able to produce energy during times when you do need it. So as more of your system becomes weather dependent, you tend to see unserved energy grow relative to LOLE. So, you know, over time in 15 or 20 years, that unserved energy will become more and more important, and we may decide to move towards that type of a metric. But there's also something to be said for, you know, once in 10 years, people can kind of have a sense of what that means. If it's, you know, 0.003% of my energy, you know, it's just pretty hard for anybody to really understand what that means besides, you know, Kevin and Zach who are neck deep in the models.
Yeah, from the technical standpoint, I totally agree with Arne. The public sees it as a binary. Did you keep my lights on or did you turn my lights off? And so from that perspective, I think 1 in 10 provides some value to the public. I do think it makes sense to monitor and use these other metrics, understand what the risks are, the depth and duration, so forth. But ultimately, I think there's some merit to the 1 day in 10 standard. I had one other observation for that. I lost my train of thought.
Well, I really appreciate y'all again taking the time to share your expertise. Really great presentations. Also want to thank Jessica Diaz for the logistics and helping pull this all together. She dropped the link in the chat. That'll be posted, the recording, the slides. Reach out to me if you have any other questions or feedback. Thanks again, and that concludes our training for today. Have a great one.
So
Thanks all.